Welcome to our deep dive into the world of 2025. You've got a pretty hefty stack of stuff here from The Economist, huh?
Looks like it.
Mostly from the World Ahead 2025, I see. Articles, graphics, even a whole section on wild cards. Someone's been busy.
Definitely looks like it, yeah.
So are you ready to see what these experts thought 2025 would be like?
I'm all set.
All right. Well, it's interesting because, we're looking back at this just 2 years after they made these predictions.
Right.
So it's a pretty good chance to see how accurate they were, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. I think that's a big part of the fun of this.
Exactly. All right. Let's start with something I know will grab your attention.
Yeah.
The possibility of a second Donald Trump presidency. You've got that Mangier scale of policy plausibility graphic.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that one?
Yes. From way back in 2023.
That's right.
It's fascinating how the Economist tried to figure out which Trump policies were the most likely to happen. Restrictions on immigration, taking a hard line with China, those were all pretty high up there.
And those have some pretty major implications, don't they? Especially when you consider all the other things we're going to talk about, like global trade and, international relations and all that. Do you think? Did The Economist did they predict how these trade wars would escalate?
It's interesting. They definitely mentioned trade wars as like a possible outcome, but how intense things actually got is, well, that's always hard to predict, isn't it?
It really is.
But going back to Trump, remember that whole idea of reinventing government? The Economist definitely thought his way of doing things with policy and leadership. Well, let's just say they thought it could be a little disruptive.
To put it mildly. All right, let's move on to something a bit less political, but just as important. Let's talk about technology, specifically AI. You've got crunch time for AI in your stack. What stood out to you the most in that article?
Well, one thing that really surprised me was they talked about companies secretly using AI.
Really?
Yeah. Like, even without their bosses knowing, it really shows how much faith people had in AI, even back then. Or maybe it was desperation. I don't know.
That's interesting.
But it's definitely interesting.
That is very interesting. And what about the potential impact on drug discovery?
Yeah.
The Economist suggested that AI could, double the speed of research and development.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? Especially when you think about how important pharmaceuticals are. I mean, we have all this other information about the pharmaceutical landscape. It just makes you think.
Exactly. But, the big question is, will AI really live up to the hype?
Right. You've also got that beyond the hype piece in there too, right?
I do, yeah.
Where they actually argue that AI hasn't had as big of an impact as everyone thought it would, at least not yet.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe 2025 will be the year it either really takes off or just, fizzles out. We'll have to see.
Exactly. Now, we can't talk about global trends without talking about China. You've got quite a few articles in there focusing on China's growing influence, especially under Xi Jinping.
Oh, absolutely.
What were some of the things that jumped out to you?
Well, new president, new dangers. Definitely laid out how assertive they were becoming.
Right.
Especially in the South China Sea. And that Reefs and Beefs graphic is, well, things could have gotten pretty heated there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's not just military power they were concerned about, right? It seemed like China's ambitions went far beyond that.
No, definitely not.
All this stuff about post-solar power and using hydrogen for energy. It seemed like they were really trying to dominate the next generation of green technology.
Oh, for sure.
What did you think about that?
Well, I mean, they were also dealing with a big demographic shift, an aging population that's highlighted in silver-haired lining.
Right.
And that creates both challenges and opportunities.
It really does. Did any of the other things you read mention how China was planning to handle that?
I think so. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk about what The Economist said about cities.
Okay. You flagged the Cities of the Future section. And I'm particularly interested in what they had to say about those third-tier cities in China.
Yeah, like Chengdu and Chongqing.
Right.
Cities that most people had probably never even heard of a few years ago.
Exactly.
But now they're becoming these huge economic centers. The Economist definitely highlighted how much they were growing. But they also warned that all this growth could strain resources and maybe even cause some social unrest. Rapid growth always comes with a price.
That's very true. Speaking of unpredictable futures, let's talk about those wild cards.
Yeah.
I mean, The economists really let their imaginations run wild with this section, didn't they? Solar storms wiping out our technology, new pandemics. I mean, some of this stuff is pretty scary.
It is, yeah.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom.
No, definitely not.
Imagine if we discovered alien life. What would that do to society?
That's a great question.
Or what if the AMOC, that big ocean current, suddenly collapsed? Talk about shaking things up.
Whoa. That would change things a lot.
For sure. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that the future is always full of surprises. Even the best predictions can get thrown off course by unexpected events.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, let's switch gears for a second and talk about the economic outlook. You seem to be particularly interested in what The Economist had to say about interest rates.
Yeah, they predicted that interest rates would be falling by 2025. And, they cited things like low unemployment and slower growth as reasons for that. But they also talked about this potential vitamin boost for commodities markets, which they thought would happen because of higher demand and possibly, disruptions in supply chains.
Right.
It's pretty interesting.
It is, especially when you consider what happened with the stock market in 2024. Remember, The Economist talked about those record highs, but they also warned about inflation and rising interest rates and the potential for, corrections in the market. It's almost like they were describing a climber trying to reach the top of a really dangerous mountain, always at risk of falling.
Oh, yeah, that's a good analogy. Makes you wonder, huh? Did that big market surge make falling interest rates less likely, or did it just make things even more shaky? Maybe set the stage for a big crash. Who knows?
Yeah, good question. And speaking of potential market disruptions, we've got to talk about, the elephant in the room. Or should I say, back in the Oval Office.
Right.
You've got a few articles here that, they don't exactly paint a pretty picture of what a second Trump term could have meant for the world.
Yeah. World in Turmoil is a pretty intense title.
It is. It doesn't seem like The Economist was holding back, huh?
Not at all.
They basically argued that his contempt for allies could have really messed things up on the global stage. And remember, this was already a pretty tense time.
It was. International cooperation was already kind of fragile.
Exactly. And they weren't just worried about foreign policy. You've also got green to brown in there.
Oh, right.
That one focuses on what could have happened with domestic policy. I mean, everyone knew Trump wasn't a big fan of climate change, right? Yeah. So The Economist figured he'd just keep pushing that America First agenda. All about energy independence, even if it meant rolling back environmental regulations. What did you think about that?
Well, it's fascinating how they thought he'd actually roll back those environmental protections.
Yeah.
And they even thought he'd focus even more on fossil fuels, which is kind of funny, right? Because he was all for oil and gas before. I guess they thought political stuff would end up being more important than what he actually said he'd do.
Yeah, I guess so. And remember that powerful image they used? The one with the border wall?
Right.
Over here, it was called?
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
The Economist figured U.S. immigration policy would get even tougher.
Right.
Not just the wall itself, but the whole system. Make it way harder for people to immigrate legally. Kind of the opposite of, that whole beacon of hope idea.
Yeah, totally. They basically predicted a new wall. Not just a physical one, but like a system that would be much harder to get through.
Yeah.
New restraints, new drilling, that's what they called it. Less asylum, more deportations. They even said it would be an immigration system to be feared.
Wow. And then there's the whole issue of potential legal battles. The Economist had this whole section called Question of Justice. They thought the abortion wars would heat up again, with individual states becoming like the main battleground.
Oh, right. They thought Roe v. Wade could get overturned by the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
And then each state would get to decide.
Right. Which is a huge deal.
It is.
And I mean, it's already such a controversial issue, right? The Economist thought it would make American politics even more divided.
Oh, for sure. It just shows how much things are constantly changing,
Yeah.
What people believe and what the law says. It's always in flux.
It really is. It's interesting to see how these predictions about, a potential second Trump term all tie back to that idea of uncertainty we talked about earlier. It seems like The Economist thought it would have made the future even harder to predict.
Yeah. Both in America and around the world.
Exactly. But what about the Democrats? What did The Economist think would happen to them if Trump had won again?
Well, there's this article called What Now for the Democrats?
Right.
And it basically dives into that exact question. They predicted a lot of soul searching, a lot of debates about what the party should do next.
So did they think that Democrats would, move further to the left, become more progressive in response to Trump. It makes sense, but it could also divide the party, couldn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly what The Economist suggested. They thought the Democrats might lurch to the left, but that it could cause some real tension between, the moderates and the progressives.
Right, like a battle for the soul of the party, as some people were saying back then.
Yeah, that's it.
It just reminds us that even within one political party, there are so many different points of view.
Totally.
But even with all those potential problems, The Economist also said that Democrats were pretty resilient.
Yeah, they pointed to their history, They've adapted to a lot of changes in the past.
They have. And they're pretty good at getting people to vote based on shared values.
That's true.
Which kind of shows how politics works. It's like this back and forth between different ideas and different people in power.
Yeah, it's all cyclical.
Exactly. It just reminds us that even when it seems like things are bad, political parties and movements can always change and find new ways to connect with people. Now, stepping back from all the political stuff, it seems like The Economist was kind of pessimistic about the world in 2025. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say so. They saw all these things happening at once, like a potential Trump win, all the global tension and all the uncertainty around technology. They thought it would make the future pretty unpredictable and maybe even a little dangerous. But it's important to remember that these were just predictions.
Right.
Just possibilities based on what they knew back then.
Exactly. It's not like it was set in stone or anything. It's all about understanding what's happening, thinking about different possibilities, and then using that knowledge to figure out how to deal with whatever happens. Speaking of which, I wanted to go back to something we talked about earlier, that whole thing about AI revolutionizing drug discovery.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
You got making pharma go faster in your stack, right?
Yeah.
And I know you're really into all the ways that technology is changing healthcare.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And this article really gets into the details of how AI could speed up every part of drug development, finding new drug candidates, designing clinical trials, everything.
Wow.
The Economist even thought it could double how productive R&D is.
Really?
Yeah. Imagine, getting life-saving treatments to people twice as fast.
That would be huge. I mean, think about all those people who are, waiting for new treatment.
Exactly. And it's not even just about speed. AI could also help us make medicine more personalized, tailored to your specific genes. That's what A New Hope is all about.
Oh, right. That one really dives into the potential of mRNA technology, doesn't it? It's amazing how big a role that played in those COVID vaccines. And now they're talking about using it to make personalized cancer vaccines. That's incredible.
It is. It's you're training your own immune system to fight those specific cancer cells.
It really does feel like we're on the verge of something big in medicine, doesn't it? All this new technology is changing everything, how we prevent disease, diagnose it, treat it. But I guess we shouldn't get too carried away with all the cool tech stuff. We've still got some big problems to deal with, like climate change. You've got sensitivity about climate in your stack. What did The Economist think about that?
Well, they knew it was tough to predict climate change accurately.
Yeah.
It's a complicated system with so many moving parts. But they weren't totally pessimistic. There was a little bit of hope in there, too.
When I was just looking at your notes, it says something about fusion power. Were they really talking about that back in 2023?
They were. It seemed like things were moving away from those huge government-funded projects and towards smaller private companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems. They were doing some really interesting work.
Wow. Fusion power. Clean, limitless energy. If they could actually figure that out, it would change everything.
It really would. It would be a total game changer. But speaking of pushing boundaries, what about space? You've got Watch This Space in there. I'm guessing you're just as excited about that as I am.
Oh, absolutely. What were they predicting back then? Did they think we'd have people back on the moon by 2025?
They did. Both NASA and those private companies were racing to get there. And, the discovery of water ice on the moon really got everyone fired up about lunar exploration again.
It's not just about planting a flag anymore, is it? It's about, scientific discoveries, finding new business opportunities, and maybe even becoming a multi-planetary species.
Exactly. So I guess as we wrap up this deep dive into 2025, it seems like The Economist saw a world that was about to go through some major changes, a possible second Trump term, the rise of AI, climate change. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And don't forget, these were just predictions, right? Just possibilities based on what they knew back then. What really stands out to you from all of this? What are you going to be watching closely as we go deeper into the 2020s?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the future isn't set in stone, you know? It really depends on the choices we make, both as individuals and as a society. Those predictions we talked about, they're not guarantees, they're just possibilities.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to deal with the tough stuff and take advantage of the opportunities that come our way.
Very well said. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of 2025. We hope you enjoyed this look back at what The Economist thought the future would hold.
Remember, stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop asking questions about the world around you.
We'll see you next time.